The office was quiet, too quiet, except for the steady hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. My desk was buried under stacks of reports, sticky notes curling at the edges, a half-empty coffee mug sweating condensation onto the papers. I stared at my laptop screen. The email notification blinked like a neon warning, promotion denied. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The hum of the lights, the faint creak of the building settling, even the clock ticking on the wall, everything felt louder, sharper, mocking. Memories flashed. My first successful project. The applause of the team. Handshakes, pats on the back, quiet smiles of recognition. I could almost feel their warmth again, the fleeting sense that I belonged, only to be replaced by this cold digital dismissal. I gripped my coffee mug tighter. My knuckles whitened. It was just a cup, just a screen, just words typed and sent. But somehow it felt like a verdict against me. A sentence. For 5 years, I built loyalty into their walls, yet they never built trust in me. Tonight, that ends. I didn't know how it would end, or if it would even matter. All I knew was that something inside me shifted in that moment, a quiet, simmering awareness that blind patience had its limits. The office smelled faintly of paper and stale coffee. Outside, the city lights blurred through the glass windows, indifferent and sparkling. I stayed quiet, letting the silence speak what words could not. I wondered, not for the first time, how someone could watch me work, see me succeed, and still look past me. How could loyalty be invisible? How could effort be invisible? And in that quiet, almost suffocating stillness, I realized I wouldn't fade quietly. I wouldn't bow to this invisible wall. Something had to give, and maybe tonight was the first night I would start to take it back. I started my career with hope, a quiet kind of hope that feels like the first morning light seeping through blinds. I was loyal, hardworking, the kind of employee who stayed late not because anyone asked me to, but because I believed in what I was building. My family, small but fierce, believed in me too. My mom used to say, "Your work will speak for you, even when the world doesn't notice." And for a long time, I believed her. I had a mentor once, someone who saw potential before I could see it in myself. He'd lean back in his chair, eyes soft but sharp, and tell me, "You don't just work here. You belong here. Just wait, they'll notice." Those words stayed with me for years, like a lighthouse in a fog I didn't always understand. The early victories felt like proof of that promise. I remember my first successful project, the spreadsheets, the presentations, the countless late nights, culminating in applause, pats on the back, nods of approval. My peers would smile, sometimes linger to ask questions, to learn what I'd done differently. I felt valued. I felt seen. But the cracks began slowly, almost imperceptibly. Promotions were given to colleagues with fewer achievements. Whispering office politics danced just beyond my awareness. Managers would pass me by in the hall, side glances that never met my eyes. My work was praised but never rewarded in ways that mattered. I told myself patience would be rewarded. Loyalty has its price, I thought, though I was about to learn it's not always fair. The office itself became a stage for subtle betrayals. I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights, the clatter of keyboards, the distant murmur of meetings that I wasn't invited to. My coffee cup sat half empty as I hunched over reports, sticky notes curling at the edges like the small dreams that quietly piled up around me. I felt a weight I didn't fully understand, like carrying invisible expectations no one acknowledged. I remember one day, walking past the HR office, overhearing a snippet of conversation. "We need someone who's more relatable for the leadership team." I froze, not because the words were loud, but because their meaning hit so quietly, so sharply. My work, my dedication, my loyalty, invisible. Yet, I held on to the hope that had guided me from the beginning. I believed that if I kept showing up, if I stayed diligent, the pattern would break. I believed recognition would come, not tomorrow, not next week, but eventually. That was my slow-burning trap. Hope entwined with loyalty, a belief that effort alone could outweigh indifference. I stayed quiet, but the silence had its own language, whispering truths I wasn't ready to face. And deep down, I knew there was a reckoning coming, even if I didn't yet know its shape. I remember the day as if it were etched in fluorescent light and stale coffee. My inbox chimed, a small, unassuming ping, but it carried a weight that felt physical, like a door slamming shut in my chest. I opened it. Promotion denied. I stared at the words, blinked. Read them again. My fingers trembled slightly as I scrolled down, half expecting a mistake. Maybe a line explaining it. Maybe anything. But there was nothing. Just the cold, corporate finality. A week earlier, I had submitted every report flawlessly, exceeded every target, even stayed late to cover a colleague's project when they couldn't. I had thought maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. I looked across the office. My team buzzed with quiet chatter, unaware of the quiet storm brewing at my desk. I saw someone I had trained, someone younger, someone less experienced, get congratulated on a promotion. Their smile was wide, radiant, almost mocking in its innocence. I felt a hollow ache. Not this time, my manager said later, leaning against the doorway, arms crossed. Maybe next year. You know, we need someone more experienced. The words landed like stones in my stomach. More experienced. I had outperformed expectations, surpassed targets, carried projects that faltered in others' hands. And yet, I was invisible. I clenched my jaw, let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. How could loyalty, effort, and results be invisible? The office sounds shifted. The chatter felt sharper, the click of keyboards mocking, chairs creaking like the walls themselves were laughing. Every sound seemed amplified, echoing the humiliation I couldn't voice. I sat there, staring at the blinking cursor on my screen. My inner monologue raced. Was I too quiet? Too diligent? Too loyal? I had believed that patience would be rewarded, that consistency would be recognized. But recognition had passed me by, time and time again. I remember the sting more vividly than the email itself, the feeling of my work, my commitment, being weighed and found lacking. Not by merit, but by politics, by favoritism, by invisible walls no one acknowledged. That night, I didn't leave my desk. I began quietly documenting everything. Emails, performance reviews, project outcomes. Every instance where fairness had been twisted, overlooked, or outright ignored. I started a folder, naming it simply, Truth. It was the first act of quiet rebellion, the first seed of awakening. I realized the system wasn't blind, it was selective. It wasn't fairness that was absent, it was integrity. And if I wanted justice, I would have to show it myself, methodically, calmly, without letting anger dictate my steps. I stayed late that night, surrounded by papers and screens, the office empty but alive with its own hum. And in that silence, I made a decision. I would not let this pattern define me. I would not let them see my despair, but I would let them see the reckoning that came after. The lights flickered softly above, and I felt the first spark of resolve. The storm had begun, quiet, deliberate, and patient. The days blurred together after that night. The office felt smaller, heavier, like the walls themselves had learned to watch me. My manager's presence became suffocating, each glance carefully measured, each word dripping with subtle dismissal. "Maybe focus on the basics for now," they said one morning, while sliding a stack of menial reports onto my desk. "We'll see about bigger responsibilities later." The words should have been harmless, but they weren't. Every spreadsheet, every minor task, felt like a reminder that no matter how much I contributed, I was being minimized. My accomplishments were being folded into invisibility, reduced to tasks no one else wanted to touch. Colleagues were no better. Some avoided eye contact, hesitant to share a smile. Others whispered just loud enough for me to catch fragments. "She thinks she's next. Funny how it never happens for her." I could feel their distance like a chill creeping across my skin. And sometimes, just sometimes, I caught a glance, a subtle smirk when I walked away from a project they'd sabotaged. Rain pelted the windows one evening as I walked home, the streets shimmering under neon reflections. I pressed my forehead to the glass of a bus window, staring at the distorted lights, my own reflection splitting across the wet glass. I felt the confusion pressing in, the frustration coiling in my chest. Why was I here, giving everything, and still being overlooked? There were moments I questioned everything. I thought about resigning, about walking away from a place that seemed to feed on loyalty and spit out recognition. I imagined telling my family, hearing their disappointment, or worse, their quiet concern that I was wasting years of my life on people who would never see me. And yet, in those moments of despair, something shifted. I realized that anger could either consume me or fuel me. The injustice was no longer just a weight, it became a lens, sharpening my vision. Every petty assignment, every slight, every whisper in the hallway was now evidence. One afternoon, my manager assigned me to reorganize a filing cabinet, the same one we'd all ignored for months. As I sorted through stacks of documents, I noticed patterns: emails buried under trivial complaints, overlooked memos praising others, meeting notes that erased my contributions. I began to quietly document them, just as I had with the earlier folder. The rhythm of my discovery became strangely meditative. The office's fluorescent hum, the rustle of paper, the faint scent of stale coffee, all of it framed my awakening. I started connecting dots, mapping favoritism, tracing the subtle threads of manipulation. Each revelation stoked a quiet, simmering determination. I began to understand the depth of the system. It wasn't incompetence or chance that had denied me my place. It was deliberate, a hierarchy that rewarded the right faces, the right smiles, the right quiet compliance. And for the first time, I wasn't just angry. I was patient, deliberate, and methodical. By the time I left that night, rain dripping off my umbrella, I wasn't the same person who had stared at that promotion-denied email. The storm inside me had shifted from confusion to resolve. Every small injustice was a step toward clarity. Every whisper, every smirk, every cold glance was now a signpost pointing to the reckoning I was preparing. I walked home slowly, listening to the city hum, feeling the weight of the coming plan settle over me. I knew the journey wasn't over. Not yet. But the first seeds of quiet, intelligent revenge were taking root. And I would wait, patient, calm, unseen. I remember the night I first opened the labor law handbook. The office lights were long gone, the city outside a blur of rain-streaked streetlights. I sat at my kitchen table, papers spread around me like a map of every slight, every overlooked accomplishment, every dismissal I had endured. The words on the page felt like a lifeline. Rights I didn't know I had, policies I had assumed only existed in theory. Success stories of ordinary employees standing up to injustice. People like me, invisible until they weren't. I stood in front of the mirror later that night, documents clutched in my hands. My reflection looked back tired but unbroken. For the first time in years, I saw someone who could fight, not recklessly, but deliberately. I won't let years of betrayal define me, I whispered to myself, my voice small but unwavering. I began strategizing. Every email, every performance review, every overlooked memo became evidence. I made folders, spreadsheets, timelines. I reached out to a lawyer recommended by a colleague I trusted, someone who had handled similar cases quietly but effectively. Everything counts, the lawyer said, flipping through my documentation. Even the smallest detail. Consistency is your ally. It felt surreal, turning my frustration into preparation, my anger into structure. There was a strange thrill in connecting the dots, evidence of favoritism, patterns of negligence, documented bias. Every little note, every forgotten acknowledgement, every whispered excuse became a step toward clarity, toward justice. Small victories began to arrive, almost imperceptibly. A preparatory hearing confirmed that my evidence was credible. A trusted colleague, whom I had feared would remain silent, offered a statement corroborating the unfair treatment. A minor procedural win, a scheduling change, a corrected memo, was a spark of acknowledgement that the system could, in fact, respond to truth. Through it all, I felt a quiet shift inside me. The helplessness that had followed every denied promotion was fading, replaced by something sharper, steadier. Patience honed into strategy, anger refined into resolve. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was orchestrating. The city outside was dark and quiet as I left the office one evening, my briefcase heavier with folders than usual. Rain-slicked streets reflected neon signs, and for the first time, the reflections felt like mirrors of my own emerging strength. I walked with intention, knowing that every careful step I took now was part of a longer path, one that would end in acknowledgement, one way or another. And in the stillness of that night, staring at my reflection in the windowpane as the bus passed, I realized something profound. Justice wasn't sudden. It wasn't dramatic. It was earned, meticulously, deliberately, like every moment I had spent documenting, planning, and standing firm despite the weight of years of indifference. I wasn't the same person who had walked home under the first rains of frustration. I was quieter, but sharper. I was still cautious, but resolute. And most importantly, I knew that when the moment came, I would stand not as someone seeking revenge, but as someone claiming what had always been theirs. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and old leather, the faint tang of ink lingering from stacks of documents. Footsteps echoed along the marble floor as spectators shuffled into their seats. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, cutting sharp lines across the room, highlighting dust motes dancing in the air. I sat at the plaintiff's table, folders neatly stacked, evidence organized with meticulous care. My hands rested on the leather surface, calm, though my heart still beat a little faster than usual. Across from me, the company's attorneys whispered, scanning notes, plotting how to undermine me. "Do you really believe this proves discrimination?" one of them asked, voice coated with feigned incredulity. I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence do part of the work. Then, in a measured voice, I began presenting my case. Each email, each performance review, each overlooked memo was laid out, a pattern of neglect and favoritism emerging in black and white. The judge listened, occasionally leaning forward, her expression inscrutable. "Explain again how these assignments relate to the promotions you were denied," she asked. I described the projects, the outcomes, The hours spent correcting mistakes that weren't mine, the successes that had gone unnoticed. I spoke without anger, but the weight of years of frustration was embedded in every word. Cross-examination came next. Opposing counsel tried to poke holes, insinuating incompetence, suggesting exaggeration. But my documentation was flawless. Witnesses I had quietly secured corroborated my claims. Colleagues who had been hesitant at first now spoke with clarity, confirming the pattern of systemic neglect. Emails were displayed on the projector. Performance metrics were examined. Notes from HR meetings were read aloud, revealing subtle biases, unspoken rules that had kept me overlooked. Each piece of evidence was a puzzle piece, and together they formed a clear picture: deliberate, consistent injustice. At one point, the opposing counsel leaned forward, a smug smile forming. "You expect us to believe that minor oversights over 5 years constitute a hostile environment?" I met their gaze, calm, unwavering. "It's not about minor oversights. It's about a deliberate pattern that denied me what I had rightfully earned. And it's documented, down to the last detail." The courtroom was quiet. The judge nodded, scribbling notes, and for the first time, I felt the weight of truth bending reality in my favor. Each small victory, a witness statement, a corroborated memo, was a step closer to acknowledgement, closer to the justice I had meticulously prepared for. Hours passed, and I remained composed, letting facts, patterns, and evidence speak louder than any emotion. I didn't need to raise my voice. The silence between each revelation carried its own power. Finally, the judge spoke. "After reviewing all evidence and testimonies, it is clear that the plaintiff has been subjected to consistent professional neglect and bias. Compensation and acknowledgement of wrongdoing are warranted." Relief washed over me like a quiet tide. I didn't feel the need to gloat. I didn't jump or scream. Instead, I exhaled, letting the years of frustration, patience, and preparation settle into a calm satisfaction. Justice had been served, not through revenge, but through deliberate, earned acknowledgement. As I left the courtroom, sunlight streaming through the doors, I felt lighter. The city outside seemed sharper, more vivid. The reflections in the glass were no longer distorted. They were clear, showing someone who had endured, who had waited, and who had claimed what was rightfully theirs. I realized, quietly but firmly, that justice isn't a storm that destroys. It's a tide that slowly reshapes the shore. And today, the landscape had shifted in my favor. I walked out of the office building that morning, the sunlight catching the glass walls, fracturing into streaks of gold across the sidewalk. The city felt alive in a way it hadn't for years, every sound sharper, every color brighter. I breathed in deeply, tasting freedom that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with dignity reclaimed. At home, my family greeted me differently now. Not with surprise, not with cautious hope, but with pride that made my chest ache. My mother's eyes glistened as she said softly, "We always knew you could stand tall, no matter how long it took." My mentor, too, offered a quiet nod of acknowledgement, a recognition that went beyond words. "You endured. You acted. You prevailed." Even at work, colleagues treated me differently, not out of fear, but out of respect. Casual conversations now carried warmth, a subtle acknowledgement of what I had endured. Some approached to apologize for their silence, others simply to nod, a silent camaraderie forming where indifference once stood. I reflected often on the long years of quiet struggle, the nights spent documenting evidence, the moments of doubt that had threatened to consume me. I realized perseverance wasn't about blind endurance, it was about patience, awareness, and knowing when to act. Justice, I learned, wasn't instantaneous. It didn't strike like lightning. It arrived like a tide, slowly reshaping the landscape of my life. I thought back to the mirrored reflection I had studied late at night, surrounded by folders and papers. That person, the one who had trembled with frustration, who had doubted, who had nearly given in, was still there, but stronger, steadier, tempered by experience. I carried that self forward, not with vengeance, but with clarity and calm authority. Walking past the familiar office, I paused briefly, glancing at the polished doors, the humming lights inside. This place that had once been a source of quiet torment now felt like a backdrop to a chapter that had ended on my terms. I didn't feel triumphant in a loud, dramatic way. I felt quiet, complete. I understood something vital. Standing up for oneself doesn't just demand courage. It demands patience, intelligence, and an unwavering belief in the value of one's own truth. Betrayal may linger, injustice may linger longer, but both can be transformed into a path toward recognition and peace. As I walked away, sunlight reflecting on the streets like a promise, I whispered to myself, justice isn't just a verdict, it's the courage to turn betrayal into truth. And in that moment, I knew the story wasn't just about winning a case. It was about reclaiming dignity, rewriting my narrative, and finally, standing in the full light of my own worth. I look back at the years I spent waiting, wondering if my efforts mattered, if my loyalty was seen. I realize now that patience alone is not enough, and silence can never carry the weight of truth. Loyalty should never be blind. Patience should never be silent. Stand for your worth, because when truth meets courage, even the walls built against you crumble, and justice finds its voice. If this story inspired you, smash that like button, drop a comment sharing your own story, and subscribe for more courtroom revenge stories that prove patience, courage, and truth always matter.